So, congratulations. You're thinking now about exiting the business that you built, perhaps over decades. Regardless if it's a family transition, an employee owned structure, or to an outright new ownership, this process can be stressful. So, stick with me as I walk you through 10 simple steps to making this a stress free transition.
Welcome to the Launch Capsule. With your host, James DuBos. Buckle up because your launch capsule begins now.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Hey, this is Jim DuBos, and thanks for joining me on another episode of the Launch Capsule, where today we're going to focus on selling your business in 10 simple steps. I want you to think of this as a tactical, step-by-step list. I have a document for you for free. All you have to do is email me at entrepreneurship@dubos.me, and I'm happy to send this to you in a written form so that you can follow along. Step number one, define the exit goal. I know it sounds kind of simple, but really what we're doing here is identifying the personal goal why you as the entrepreneur or group of entrepreneurs have decided that this is the time to exit the business. Is it for personal wealth building? Is it because you want more time on your hands? Is this a legacy transaction? The next step of this in defining the exit goal is determining the ideal buyer type. Because if it's not a family transition, or if it's not an employee-owned transition, then you have to think about the type of buyer that you would be willing to sell your business to. Examples might be a strategic buyer, a financial buyer, or perhaps, like I said, an employee-owned, a group of employees that perhaps we would call that an internal transaction. And then lastly, you want to begin to think about a target sale date. What would be, in your ideal circumstance, the target date that you want the transaction to take place? And then the second part of this is, what is your post-sale role? Are you going to stay on for a period of time? Are you going to be a consultant for a period of time? Or are you just going to wave your hand goodbye and exit the business? These three things really help you define clearly your exit goal. Next up is your exit readiness. I have on DuBos.me a full 15-question assessment. It's a simple assessment to walk you through where you are in the journey with your business and are you ready to exit? Because ultimately, this should be an asset that you're transacting, and you want to have as strong a financial outcome as possible. And so by scoring yourself in this assessment, you're going to identify gaps, things potentially like owner dependence or customer concentration, maybe a weak employee bench. You're going to see those gaps so that now you have something to begin to work against before you take the business to market. And then lastly is to get external perspectives. If you have peers who have been through transactions before, that's a great resource. Perhaps you have a formal M&A advisor already. You need a mentor or a coach. Those are things that I do as a coach. I help business owners assess and process what it's going to take to exit their business successfully and with as limited amount of stress as possible. The third area is really focused on financials and documentation. So the first thing I would say is you have to have a minimum of 3 years, but preferably 5 years of clean P&Ls and balance sheets. Fundamentally, if you're getting to a high 7-figure or 8-figure exit number, you're going to have audited financials. So if you're not in that position currently, you're going to have to begin that journey right now, and perhaps going back and auditing a year or two to be in position to have those clean financials and documentation. The other thing you want to do is normalizing what I would call add backs. It's not uncommon for entrepreneur owners to have certain types of expenses that I'm going to call owner benefits that ultimately would not exist in a formal business setting. So as an example, you might be paying yourself a salary that perhaps is a little elevated than what you would pay, say, a general manager for the business. Well, that difference, if you will, is an add back candidate. And so you can talk with your accountant of how to add that back in an organized way. You want to document that and you want to demonstrate those add backs over a period of time because that is going to affect the overall outcome as they begin looking at multiples on the business and how that is going to generate a financial outcome for you. The last component of this is really around contracts, leases, intellectual property, org chart, standard operating procedures, basically the business documentation. So if you think about it this way, if a new owner steps foot into the business tomorrow, how are they going to know how you execute your business, with whom you execute your business, and what are those contractual relationships? What are the obligations associated with any debt that you may carry, along with customer contracts and so forth? If you have IP associated in the business, obviously copies of trademarks, patents, and those types of things. So really, this is just around the documentation and financial component of the business. Okay, next up is to get a formal valuation. My recommendation here is to engage a valuation expert or an M&A advisor, but at a very minimum, valuation expert who can understand the range of value against industry multiples, as well as the various types of valuation models that are out there. This is going to give you a perspective of comps that are in your market, as well as what are the strategic value elements associated in your business and in your industry. So the idea here is, how do I drive the highest value outcome for the business itself? What is bringing value to a potential buyer? And a formal valuation will give you that insight. Number 5 is to assemble your deal team. So at a very base level, your deal team is going to consist of an M&A advisor, investment banker. Those individuals will have contacts, relationships, and will be able to execute a formal process with you as you bring your business to market. You're going to need a CPA and financial analyst to make sure that you understand the financial characteristics of the requests that you're going to get from potential buyers and how to generate positive outcomes in that journey, as well as helping you understand any potential tax liabilities and things to consider as you're beginning this journey. The third will be the transaction attorney themselves. It may be an individual, could be a firm, a team based upon the size of the transaction. But you need someone who are familiar with mergers and acquisitions, particularly in your state and based upon the geographies that you're selling. It could be multi-state jurisdictions based on the type of business. And then finally, you need a personal wealth and individual tax advisor for each individual owner in the business who's executing the transaction. That is your basic deal team. There may be others that you want to have on that list, but these are the basics of the individuals that I would recommend. Number 6, focusing on improving the business. My very first transaction of the 7 that I've executed, my first transaction took 4 months to execute. The last transaction that I exited took 16 months to execute. Prior to exiting either one of those businesses, I needed to focus on a handful of things to make sure that the transaction was going to be a success for the new owner and to generate as positive a financial outcome as possible. So like I said earlier, by taking the assessment, you begin to get a scorecard of where you need to focus to drive the most value in a potential exit situation. But here's a handful of things that I can guarantee you are going to be on every buyer's mind. Number 1 is going to be the leadership bench. No buyer is going to buy a business that is owner dependent. So they want to know that the leadership and management structure that are in the company can execute the business without you. The second is focusing on margins, improving margins, and any recurring revenue opportunities in the business. The value of one-time revenue versus the value of recurring revenue are radically different. And so by having a strong recurring revenue component of the business, you're going to drive up the multiples associated with any potential transaction. The third is key customers and vendors. Number one, a buyer looks at risk and wants to make sure that no customer consumes more than 10% of the overall revenue stream of the company. They're going to look at churn, and they want to see a recurring, returning customer transaction related relationship in the business. On the vendor side, they want to know that the supply chain is strong. There's no risk in the vendor supply, things like unpaid debt or slow response times. What are things that could potentially upset the transaction process with customers? And then lastly, they're going to look at key employees and employee retention plan. What has been the current culture? What has been the current turnover? And are there any open positions that are at risk? Are there any key employees that are at risk? And how do we develop a plan to keep those employees in place? So at a very high level, that's focusing on improving the business. But like I said, I have an assessment that judges the business based upon 15 characteristics that I've used in my business very successfully to get myself to a successful transaction. Okay, and number 7 is when we go to market. And there's 3 basic things that are going to take place in this process. Number 1, you're going to prepare the confidential information memorandum, or what we refer to as a SIM. That is going to be something that a potential buyer would sign a non-disclosure agreement and receive, that contains all of your information at a high level. And I'm going to create a separate podcast episode just on preparing the SIM. So stay tuned for that. But in effect, you're going to have the teaser, which would be an anonymized one-pager to basically advertise the SIM. Then once an NDA is signed, the SIM gets sent out to the potential buyers. You're going to develop a buyer list with an M&A advisor, whether that be strategic, private equity, any potential competitors who actually might be in an acquisition mode. And you'll build that list. And hopefully the M&A representative will be bringing you potential buyers as well. And then there'll be this management process for outreach and non-disclosures. Now, to give you a perspective, in my last transaction, when we brought the teaser to market, we signed 67 NDAs. So basically had what we refer to as an indicator of interest, an IOI process. We signed over 65 NDAs, produced those SIMs to those individuals, and then got LOIs, or letters of intent, back from almost 20 of those over 60 potential interested parties. And so this process, okay, is really where step 8 comes in, is you're beginning to negotiate the deal. You're evaluating the letters of intent, because you're going to get all types of offers and opportunities, and you're going to immediately be able to discern, going back to question 1, why are you doing this? Why are you exiting the business? And does the LOI fulfill those indicators, right? Those reasons. And so you evaluate the LOIs, right? So you're in this stage 8, negotiating the deal. You're evaluating the LOIs. Then you begin to look at the valuation, the structure of a potential deal: cash, earnout, seller notes. What is the structure that they're generally proposing in an LOI? And then you're going to be evaluating things like tax implication and asset versus stock sale and some of these types of things. So at the very high level, you're beginning this negotiation of the deal through the LOI process. In step 9, it's a due diligence process, and it's the final paperwork and agreements. And this is, I'll say, probably the most onerous step of the process, because it's where you're going to establish a data room. You're going to have a myriad of buyer due diligence requests. And I have a program built around this component: preparing for due diligence, so that when these requests come, because it's going to take a village, you're going to impact a lot of your employee community inside of the business, basically responding to these buyer diligence requests. As well, you'll be working with your attorneys, looking at the final purchase agreements, preparing what I would refer to as the definitive purchase agreement, any fundamental reps and warranties. If you're gonna, based on the components of the agreement, or what are the considerations that you have to walk through. And I'm gonna do a separate episode talking specifically around purchase agreements and some of the things to contemplate in terms of structure, in terms of verbiage, that through my own journey, that I think is helpful going into a potential transaction. And ultimately, you get to the place where you finalize the purchase agreement with your attorney community and begin to set a close date. And so this is step 10, right? Close and transition, as I'll call it, where you're going to execute the closing documents and you'll have the waterfall of the funds associated with the transaction. You're going to prepare your communications to both employees and to customers. And then you're going to go through the support and post-sale transition per the agreement, obviously, but also based upon your own individual characteristics that you set in the very beginning of this process. So at a very high level, those are the 10 steps to exiting your business. Like I said, through some of these components, through some of these stages, there's specific things to contemplate. And in the future, I'll have episodes around those specifics to help you be prepared as an entrepreneur as you go through this exit journey. Look, I want you to know this can and should be a joyful experience, because if your why is really connected to the purpose of your business, to the care of the people in your care, right? Those employees who helped you along this journey, it should be very fulfilling and rewarding to go through this process. And so look, thanks for taking the time to listen. Please feel free to comment. Send me an email at entrepreneurship@dubos.me. I'm happy to send you the document that I used and in this preparing of this podcast. Have an awesome day.
That's a wrap for today's episode of The Launch Capsule. With your host and mentor to success, James DuBos. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and share.